I've called this talk Feelings Are Data. And as Teresa said, I am a statistician, but I also trained as a therapist when I was young. So I've always been very in tune with how people feel. And somewhere along the line, I've made this sort of mix of like, let's look at the data on this. And in fact, my first so as Teresa said, I used to work at a think tank in London called New Economics Foundation. I started working there about 2001, and I was looking at how you could measure population well-being. And in 2004, I read a paper by this man, Daniel Kahneman, who I'm sure all of you have heard about. And effectively, it was about yesterday, this paper. And it was about what he called his methodology, day reconstruction theory. And I want to start with this because it's the first time that the data really came alive for me and really made me sort of think in a different way. I mean, I was doing work on, life satisfaction, other data, but this really brought a different dimension to it. And what he did was he asked people, what activities did you do yesterday? His actual first survey, which this is the real data from, was with 1,000 women, maybe 2,000 women, but so it was working women. And he asked them, what did they do? So all of them, that's the percentage line, said they worked, and they worked on average 6.9 hours a day. And you can see all the activities they did, including, if you look right down the bottom, what he rather delicately called intimate relations, which they spent 0.2 of an hour. So what's that, 12 minutes? And 11% of them did it. And so it was ranking them. And you can see there what people do. But he asked an extra question, which was, how much did you enjoy those activities? And so if you look at the rank order here, I'm now going to change it to be rank order by enjoyment instead of amount of time. And what you see is that, perhaps not surprisingly, the aforementioned intimate relations were the most enjoyable activity, but work goes right down the bottom. And the only thing that's worse is the commute to work. So what struck me was that this was both fascinating and somewhat sad, really, because we spend a lot of time at work. It's the largest activity, 7 hours a day. I think it works out something like 80 or 100,000 hours over our lifetime that we work. And it's our least enjoyable activity. So whilst I was at that time working on government policy, something clicked in me going, maybe that's something I want to work on sometime in my life. How can we make work a better experience for people? And that's what I've tended to do since I did my TED Talk in 2010. So, it's 10 years ago now. That's me 10 years ago. I had my beard and I hadn't learned to tuck my shirt in. But, and when you give a TED Talk, you kind of know it's a video that's going to define your career in lots of ways. So the great thing about it was I could summarize my 10 years of work on policy in 18 minutes, not a small challenge. And it also allowed me to slightly think, okay, what do I want to do next? And I returned to work to think about it. And I really come to the strong feeling that feelings are data and we can use that data. But we also have to know the limits to that data. So when you're working with subjective data, there are limitations to it. And as a statistician, I've kind of had to accept, almost like Wittgenstein said at the end of his treatise, that that which cannot be put into language, we should not try. That there's elements of well-being and happiness that we shouldn't try too hard to put into numbers. I think we should use other methodologies, but there's elements that we can do. Now, if I'm going to take you through a little journey about what feelings are for, and how we can measure them and the limits to that measurement, and then how we can use that data in organizations. But I'm going to slightly take you on a journey about neuroscience and even evolutionary psychology to start off. And the question really is, what are feelings for? So feelings are highly functional. Every human being has them. And there's a neuroscientist I really like called Antonio Damasio. He's written quite a few books. Self Comes to Mind, The Feeling of What Happens, and recently something called The Strange Order of Things, which is a slightly strange title, but he's basically talking about the evolutionary psychology and about how when feelings are merged in organisms. And he actually says that feelings come way before cognition, that basically even simple single cell organisms had to regulate themselves, and they had to achieve homeostasis, basically stability. One of the key insights about life is that cells have an inside and an outside, and they're basically trying to maintain a structure inside the cell membrane. And so, at a very, very early stage, organisms had to monitor their environment, and they had to react to that environment. It's basically a stimulus response mechanism. And he talks about, when you get into primates and sentient beings, that there are really three functions to emotions and feelings. They firstly help us monitor our environment. Are we a good fit for it? They help motivate actions. And then when we take actions, it helps us adjust them. And I'm going to basically mimic that in this talk. And I'm going to talk about firstly how we can pick up that monitoring signal, the sort of emotions that help motivate us towards great behaviors in organizations, and how we can adjust those as we go along. So firstly, monitor. At its very simplest level, feelings are a good, bad signal. Should we approach or should we avoid? And happiness, in this sense, is a good, bad signal. Has this event gone well or not? When you meet someone for the first time, are they a friend or a foe? We have this signal. Sometimes we have a signal. In fact, most of our signals are don't care less. We've got lots of stimulus, lots of perception going on. Most of it we ignore. But if something's a danger, we need to know about it. And if it's an opportunity, we need to know about it. And so in that sense, there's a good, bad signal. Now, the interesting thing is that we can put a number to this. So I've gradiated the smiles there, but you can put numbers to them. And this is the core to what we do at Friday Pulse, is we basically ask people, how are you feeling at work? We actually tend to use a week because we need to create an episode that we're working with. And over the years, I've experimented with different episodes of work, from a day. In fact, you can do sub-days, like Kahneman did effectively when he did day reconstruction theory. He had sub-days. You can do a whole day, you can do a week, you can do a fortnight, you can do a month. By the time over your month, you've forgotten what you're doing. And in fact, even a month, you've forgotten the first 2 weeks. We've settled on doing a week at Friday Pulse. That's why we call Friday Pulse every Friday, but as the most pragmatic one in an organizational context. And we can ask people where they're very unhappy, right through to where they're very happy. People can give you an answer to this. They can answer it very, very clearly. If you think about asking people how engaged you are at work, I think people don't really understand how to give you a gradated answer on that. They can say they're more or less, perhaps, but if you ask them how meaningful their work is, they definitely have no idea what the top of the scale is. What would meaningful work absolutely look like? Engagement's a bit like that. Engagement's not a term we use very much. Whereas if we ask about happiness, it's very firmly located in the individual. I can give you a response to that. So everybody has no problem answering this question and giving you a sense of how they feel. And when you get data like this, you can start tracking it by doing it every week. And I want to show you, very early on, this is COVID. This is COVID hitting our clients. So on the left of the graph, you can see pre-COVID, bumbling along. 70 is about average. It was 69.6, the mean of employee experience pre-COVID. We have seasonal peaks, typical peak over the holiday period at Christmas. We actually have lower response rates. People are on holiday, they're not at work. Those who are at work are answering and saying they're very happy because it's sort of a time of year when you are. But basically, things go along. And then you can see in March, COVID hitting. And this is across all of our clients, okay? So this is summarizing across all of our clients, North America, Europe, particularly the UK and North America. And it hit all at the same time, pretty much, didn't it, in March? And you can see that everybody, we had lockdown in the UK. I know across the US, it was similar timing. And what happened is people went into emergency mode, but they started to put systems in place. And what you can see is that over the period coming back from that, slowly getting back up to where we were. But I want to say two things about this data. This is not a representative sample. This is our clients. Our clients are seeing this data every week. They are doing everything they can do to build that resilience. So they're seeing which teams are not doing so well. They're starting to intervene with them. So I would certainly hope that our clients are doing better than the average organization because they've been so intentional about it during that period. But I just wanted to very quickly show you, by having that very simple metric about weekly thing, about how powerful it is. And in organizations everywhere, teams, divisions, have setbacks. This is a setback, a global setback, but we see this pattern very regularly at a team level, a division level, even an organizational level. An organization, perhaps gets into a funding crisis. We've certainly had this with a couple of clients, not to do with COVID. Otherwise, they have to lay off 100 people, and the organization does this curve. Yeah. And so it's a very typical thing. And if you have this data to work with in real time, you can start to observe it, track it, and intervene where you need to. So really, that's the monitor part of it, that you can monitor it. And I said earlier that I think I need to understand what the limits are. The happiness KPI, that we call it, is really picking up that good, bad signal, and it's really, really good for it. But then we get into the more complex space about what does it motivate, what behaviors does it motivate? And we get into really what positive and negative emotions are for, in a sense. So there's lots of theories in psychology, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience about emotions. And one of the ones which, had a lot of credence in the 70s and 80s and right through to anyone that watched the film Inside Out is that there's a universal primary set of emotions. So typically anger, fear, sadness, happiness, disgust, surprise can be included in there. And Paul Ekman is the researcher that's most associated with this. He was actually an advisor to Inside Out. And there's a degree to which this is a good categorization, but is not actually correct from a neuroscience perspective, in that emotions are blended and that there's not any particular fingerprint of any emotion. And partly, if we have an emotion such as excitement, it's actually very similar as fear. It's more about how do we interpret them, and energetically they're quite similar. But it's still useful. We still talk about it this way, and our interpretation is of course, really, really important. And in many ways, that the so-called negative emotions, they're not negative for being dysfunctional, they're highly functional, but they're really reacting to negative events. So anger and fear are part of the fight and flight mechanism. So when we're angry, it's about someone perhaps overstepping a mark, a violation of a norm, and we're going to deter a future violation. When we're frightened, there's something that's affecting our well-being in the immediate here and now. Probably we need to take evasive action. That can be run away, that can be freeze, that can be gather together in a group for safety. They're all valid responses to fear. In an organizational context, fear can be staying silent in a meeting. That's freeze. Hope nobody notices. Keep my head down. I don't want the boss to shout at me. It can be changing jobs if you in that way. Sadness is about a loss of a support system. It's not an accident in Inside Out that sadness and joy go on a journey together. Sadness and happiness are interconnected. Even Khalil Gibran, the famous Lebanese poet who wrote The Prophet, talked about our sorrow is our joy remembered. They definitely are interlinked, and sadness tends to be about a loss of a support system. But happiness, until quite recently, was mainly thought of as a signal to carry on. But then we've had an explosion of work on positive emotions. And we're starting to understand more nuances under that. But at the first cut, you can say happiness is about approach, and anger, fear, and sadness are about avoiding things. And that's that good, bad signal going on. But if we explode out what happiness and what it means is, if I ask people in surveys or directly in conversations, what is happiness to you? Some people will say to me, contentment. Others will say joy. Well, they're quite different things, contentment and joy. Joy is very high energy. Contentment's very reflective energy. They've got different, if we can use this term, which we can't, but I use anyway, they've got different evolutionary purposes. They've got different energies that they are motivating us to engage with. And we can think of other ones in the spectrum, in the array of positive emotions, such as curiosity and interest, or gratitude, amusement. And that these all have different things. So, as I said, contentment, satisfaction, quiet energies that help us reflect. Joy, awe are they're energizing us. You could put enthusiasm in there too. They're mobilizing energy. Awe is sort of reaching for a higher goal. We're inspired. We want to set ourselves higher goals, achieve more. Curiosity is exploring. Interest is focusing on a task that's perhaps difficult in the short term. There's a whole energy that psychologists talk about called flow, which is when we get so engaged things we lose track of time. And I'm amongst friends here, so I can admit that Excel spreadsheets and SPSS can take me into flow states where I lose track of time. I'm sure lots of you out there will have the same. And then we have energies which are more about connecting and bonding. And sometimes team leaders will say to me, or senior leaders say, I don't want my people to be happy. Yeah, I want them to work, and I think there's a confusion here in that sometimes happiness can seem to be trivial. There's lots of people that think that it's stupid to be happy. I would think actually it's entirely the opposite. I think we're looking for an intelligent form of happiness. But what are they getting at? Well, there are ways that we have fun where we definitely turn down our cognitive functioning. So if we're mucking around with people and we're trying to be in a group, it doesn't pay us to be our most brilliant selves. We're going to hide our light under a bushel. We're going to sort of be one of the group. We're going to share in the joke, and so. And in that sense, if you're leading a team, you don't want people to be not sharing their best selves. But there might be times, definitely are times, you want them to connect. So if you're having a laugh together, that's great if it's 5-10% of the time. But if it's 90% of the time, unless you're doing certain jobs, it's unlikely to be the most productive. So it's about recognizing that these different positive emotions have different energies about them. And if you're running a team, if you're running an organization, you want people to move through all of these. You want them to have emotional agility to move through them. There are times when you want them really focused and energized and curious. And there are times when you want them to be thinking, yeah, I've done a good job there, pat themselves on the back. And there are times you want them to be having a laugh with their colleagues because they're building the relationships that they will then come to depend on in being resilient in time. So these are the types of things that we motivate. But from a measurement perspective, this is a really messy area to measure. It's easy to say, are you happy or not? But, how curious you are, how interested you are. Interest works a bit better than some of them, actually. But, they're more difficult to measure and put on scales. And I've actually ended up thinking, I'm not so interested in measuring. I want to know that good, bad signal. That's easy for leaders to interpret. It's easy to enjoy. And you can get to stages, which I'm sure you all know about, where you can have sort of paralysis by analysis, where you've just got too much data. And I don't think it's worth going into these subtleties of emotion because it's harder for us to understand. In fact, when you work with kids, if you work with teams, and in fact, I think we even do this as adults, they'll say, I'm feeling bad. And they don't really know if they're angry or they're sad or they're frightened. They find it hard to differentiate between the emotions. And that's because they're a sort of messy space in some ways, whereas the good bad signal is very clear. So statistically, it's much easier to capture. Now, the brilliant thing is that positivity leads to good outcomes. Okay, so our traditional orthodox model is that if you work hard, you will be happy. And I'm not going to say that's untrue, but I'm going to say the other way works too. So I'm going to show you some data on happiness and success and their relationship and their interrelationship, really. I'm going to firstly look at staff retention, then productivity, then some data on creativity, and then finally even some on share price. So retention, this is working with our with our clients, and we're looking at who's unhappy and who's happy and what's their likelihood of leaving. Now, because we ask people every week, and in fact, some of this data is actually from when we were asking clients every month, we actually notice who leaves our client list. So what we did with this piece of research is that we looked at months 1 and 2, what the average score on their happiness KPI was. We then left the month 3 blank, and then we looked who left in quarter 2, months 4, 5, 6. And what we found was that the people that were happy were much less likely to leave than those who are unhappy. Now, I don't think I'm going to win a Nobel Prize like Daniel Kahneman for having this data. I think it's fairly obvious. But it's, in a way, if you've got this data in real time and you can start to see which teams are unhappy, you start to see which ones have got more flight risk. And when people start feeling unhappy at work, they start thinking about getting a job the next day. They may, if they recover, decide not to. But unhappiness is a key driver towards changing, towards leaving a job. So it's very important data to have very quickly. Second piece of data, it actually comes from Gallup data. So it's from Jim Harter. Some of you may know him. He's chief wellbeing scientist at Gallup. And they were looking in this at people's positive experience at work and the financial success of teams. And I've slightly relabeled that as happiness, but it's pretty much what it is because it's positive experiences. And what they were looking at was the success driving the happiness, this arrow, or was the happiness driving the success? They're looking 6 months apart, both bits of data, basically using structural equation modeling and looking at the cross correlations. And what they found was that both of these pathways existed. Success did lead to happiness, did lead to positive experience. But the pathway from happiness, positive experience to success 6 months later was twice as strong. And this is the sort of virtuous cycle that organizations really want to get into, where teams that are happy are productive and their productivity then builds their happiness, that there is a virtuous cycle of building, of happiness and success building on each other here. Obviously, the correlations work both ways, so you can get into whatever the opposite of a virtuous cycle is, a trough, and basically, lack of financial success leads to unhappiness, leads to more, whatever, but you've got this reinforcing positive feedback loop going on between the two of them. And their data, I think, had I haven't got it written here right in front of me, but I think it had about 100,000 people in it. So it's very strong data. The third one I want to talk about is creativity. Now, creativity is really hard to measure. So we tend to do it with things like lateral problem solving. And this is a very classic one. It's called the Duncker candle experiment. It was actually first devised in the Second World War, I think, in army training. Anyway, Duncker basically set this task for people where he gave them a box of tacks, some matches, and a candle, and he said, "Can you attach the candle to the wall in such a way that when it's lit, it doesn't drip on the floor?" It's a lateral problem solving. So you're supposed to, it's not supposed to be easy to solve, but if you know the answer, it's dead easy. You basically have to notice that there's a box there of tacks. So you actually empty the tacks, you attach that to the wall. Easy, okay, once you know. How many people solved it? So this particular piece of research basically manipulated people into a good mood or a bad mood, and it also had a control group. The control group solved it 13% of time in, I think it was 5 minutes. They then looked at the group that they put into a negative mood. They solved it 20% of the time. That's interesting more. Well, emotions are energy. So you've motivated people and energized them slightly by putting them in a bad mood. So perhaps it's not surprising. But the people they put into a good mood, over 75% of them solved it. When you're in a good mood, you see the bigger picture more. There's very famous work by Barbara Fredrickson about how positivity helps you see the bigger picture more, helps you connect things. It broadens your ability to respond to situations, your ability to see stuff. And this is just clear evidence that it's doing that. And if you think about it at work, it's doing it quite a lot. So we can also look at share price. This stuff was looking at Glassdoor data. There's also some earlier work by a guy called Alex Edmonds, which I think is better research, but it's earlier work. But Glassdoor took the ratings on Glassdoor. They grouped people into high well-being organizations and normal organizations, and they're tracking it here to the S&P 500, and they're tracking the data over time. And what they found was that the organizations with high well-being had a much higher share price growth over that period. Alex Edmonds' work, I think, is better for actually looking at the actual correlations. And what he said is that he thinks that good cultures provide 2 to 3% extra share price every year. When that compounds up, that's very big. So even at that level, we can see effects going on. So what I would say is that happiness benefits everybody. It's a goal for everybody to align on. Okay, so employees, absolutely. Who doesn't want to be happy at work? But it also builds a happy, productive culture for the organizations. But then critically, it works for teams. And this is really, really important because team leaders can be the people that are slightly threatened by any intervention that looks at employee experience because they can feel like they're going to be exposed. But if you make it in the team leader's self-interest, that basically, who doesn't want to have a team where they're more creative and less conflict? Well, this is going to be the way that you start to create it. So it's actually about aligning all of these interests. How much does it benefit people? Well, we can put estimates onto this. So What we do with this bit of thing is we look at how much does half a point change. So if you move up the scale as a team, from 3 to 3.5 or 3.5 to 4, how much is that actually going to be worth in dollars and pounds? Well, that's linked to about a 7.5% productivity rise, 17% fall in staff turnover, and at least a 10% reduction in sickness absence. There's other benefits too, so I haven't got the innovation in there too. We can also think of other things of collaboration and things, inter-team collaboration, but these are things it's easier to put figures on. And what you can find is that's for a 200-person organization, that adds up to about $1 million a year. On our website, actually, you can remove the preview from that thing at the bottom. It should just say fridaypulse.com calculator. Go to fridaypulse.com. You can put in how many people in your organization. In fact, you can also ask it a few other questions about how creative you are, how remote working you are, how customer facing you are, and it adjusts this figure so you can estimate how much improving a well-designed well-being happiness program could return investment. We typically find that there's a 5-time return on investment every year. So it's a really big impact. Question really becomes how do we improve that? And our research, we'd looked at what are the 5 big drivers of positivity at work. We'd worked a lot with Robert Half, the recruitment agency, on doing big surveys with them. And these are the 5 key factors that we find. So the first one is connect, which is that relationships are probably the most important thing for our happiness at work, and that links into trust, like Amy Edmondson will talk about psychological safety. But team relationships, how teams cooperate, whether you've got good friends at work, are really, really important. Being treated with respect, fair pay, work-life balance. We call that be fair. Empower, using your strengths, trusting, delegating people. Challenge, learning, creativity, stretch, and inspire, meaning, purpose, being part of something bigger. The final 3, you can see Daniel Pink and drive. He used to talk about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. We frame them in positive actions people can take, so they're sort of kind of easier to associate with. For some reason, Daniel Pink was thinking very individually, but I think very much more in Europe. I think we think much more socially about psychology, and they can tend to neglect that actually we're very socially motivated. When we do things together, we're more doing that. So in some ways, I don't really understand Daniel Pink's model. I'm just forgetting the name of self-determination theory, which is by DC and Ryan, talked about relatedness, autonomy, and sort of challenge. It wasn't quite the same word. But these things about fairness in organization and connect are really, really critical too. We actually measure those with 15 questions in a culture profile, which we ask our clients every quarter. It's sort of the equivalent of a staff survey, but it's still lighter. But we track the happiness every week, the good, bad signal. We then get into the drivers every quarter. And we can look at the interaction between those variables for our clients. So just like we've been tracking happiness here, and so effectively we've seen this resilience, and I would say that I think resilience is the shape of the curve here. We've also been tracking those 15 questions. And I can show you, with our clients, how they're changing over time. So we've had some things pre and post the onset of COVID, because obviously we haven't got rid of COVID, that have gone up in our client base. So creativity, influencing decisions, even feedback and strengths have slightly improved. But we've had fallers too. And the critical faller, one is about relationships, team relationships and friendships, but the other is about work-life balance. This took me by surprise, because I thought working from home, people are going to get rid of the commute. But there's something about the interaction between work and life that's totally collapsed. We don't know where it starts and where it finishes, and that's highly stressful for people. And of course, we've had people who've had young kids at home during the first, the very difficult times of work life of COVID, where they were homeschooling, and really it was very, very challenging for them. So that's bringing it down. But actually, work-life balance has stayed down. We've got 2 measurements with most of our clients afterwards, and it's stayed down across most of them. So feelings are highly functional. They help monitor and motivate us. But but they also help us adjust our behaviors, and we need to mimic that too. And the way I think we do that is by creating feedback loops in organizations that help create positive, productive cultures. So we do the team feedback loop, which is this weekly one. So sometimes Daniel Kahneman talked about thinking fast and thinking slow, and I to mimic him, I call this one feeling fast. But this is the weekly one that you measure every week, you meet as a team, and then you act and you change your adjustments. So this is the in the tortoise and the hare. This is the hare. This is spinning round quickly every week. But there is also still an organizational feedback, the thinking slow one, the one that's more strategic thinking, that's looking at those drivers, that's thinking about, okay, what are the factors across our organization and how can we do that? So that's about analyzing, planning, and acting. It's more in the sense of an orthodox staff survey. So the first one is much quicker. Now, those feedback loops are somewhat independent, but actually, if you want to build a positive, productive culture, you really want these to interact and together. So I sometimes draw them like this, that the hare and the tortoise, isn't it? That in a sense, the teams are contained within the organizational change. And if you can imagine this spinning forward, then if you're in a team and you're wanting to generate change, but the organization isn't changing, you feel like you're climbing up the inside of this bubble and it's always uphill. If the organization is changing and you're not coming with it, you're sort of getting discombobulated and you're being thrown off and bounced around inside this bubble. If you get them aligned, then that's where the sort of magic comes. Magic, in this sense, is alignment. So when you get these aligned, that's when you really release everything. It's like when you're at an airport, if you remember airports, and you're walking along and then you get to one of those travelators and you get on them and you're suddenly zipping along. That's how I see it when these two are aligned. And for me, that's the aim we're trying to get to. So I just want to wrap up with, so we've done the monitor, the motivate, and the adjust. I just want to add up some practical tips, particularly in a remote world. But if we're building trust, so many of you won't only be data analytics people, you'll manage teams, you'll be working in organizations. And there are some practical things that we can take from psychology. And as I said, I trained as a therapist. But how do we facilitate this? Because really it all comes down to the data is there. The data opens the door to conversations, but the real change comes if we can improve conversations. So really that becomes about teams being good listeners, compassionate listeners. So if you're running a team and you're running people, you've always got to be surprised. I mean, as I said, I was surprised by that data and work-life balance. Isn't that the great thing about data? That sometimes it surprises us. We've got a hypothesis and we're wrong. Whoa, we can learn from that. But as a team leader, also be prepared to be surprised by your team. Ask deepening questions. So you might say to someone, how are you? And they say, fine. If you just ask them, how are you really? You start deepening that. And there's a lot going on that's under the surface at the moment. But if you're running team meetings, how do you do that? This is sort of advice we give to team leaders. And then check out. Sometimes we hear things. We hear things through our own filters. So actually checking out what we've heard. So therapists will often call this reflecting or mirroring. I think I heard you say. If you get it wrong, someone puts you right straight away because they want to be heard. If sometimes we take our assumptions, we can do that. So good listening is at the core of it. The second thing is about good discussions, is leading good discussions. And the first one is to always notice, if you're trying to lead a discussion, that your mood matters. If you're in a bad mood, can you leave it outside the door? Because you will pollute the whole team with it if you do. So even sometimes we have to go and facilitate team meetings when we're in a bad mood. Leave it outside. Be positive. Second one is be inclusive, is that the quiet people in a group often hold the truth. It's one of the great things with surveying. We get to hear the quiet ones. Noisy people are not always right. I'm a noisy person. I'm not always right. But sometimes I've learned over the years to really draw out the quieter people. And the last one is to focus on things in your control. If you're trying to act, particularly at the team level, what can you actually do? There are some things that are beyond your control in the organization. You need to push them up to the next pay grade. You need to push them up into things, but you need to focus on things you control and find easy wins for improving it. And then just 3 tips about remote challenges and what we're seeing and psychological tips for that. And then we'll have Q&A. So first one is social connection. So Robin Dunbar will be someone that many of you have heard of. I mean, how nice to have a number named after you. What statistician wouldn't want a number named after you? Anyway, the Dunbar number is typically thought of as 150. But he also has other numbers in his pocket, and he talks about 5 and 15. 5 is close, intimate people that you share everything with, and 15 are very good friends. And most people tend to have these circles of intimacy. And actually, with COVID striking, and when we all started working at home, my advice to people was to identify your core 5, your core 15 people at work and at home, and look after those relationships. And don't worry too much about the wider circles. You can come back to that once we all settle down again. But actually investing and making sure that you look after those core ones. The second one is what's called mentalizing. I don't know if you've heard of this idea, but it's basically something we learn as a toddler. And it's about putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. It's a pre-compassion and empathy step that we basically have to put up. Imagine what they're thinking is mentalizing. And when we're on Zoom calls, team calls, Google Meets, whatever you use, I say to people, if you're trying to have a proper conversation, limit it to 4 people. Because mentalizing has a hard limit. We can't get ourselves into mind of more than 3 or 4 other people. You notice this when you're at a party, if you remember parties, and there were 4 or 5 of you having a conversation, it just about flows. The 6 or 7 people join. After 30 seconds, it's going to split into 2 groups because we can't do that. It happens very quickly. So mentalizing is really, really critical. So if you want to have an intimate or deep conversation with people, don't let it be more than 4 or 5 people on a call. And the final one is about that work-life balance one, which is about boundaries between work and home. And actually, I think that what we're finding out is that there's a lot of unproductive moments in work. And when you're working from home, I'm not convinced about the 5-day, 8-hour, 10-hour week anymore. I just moved my team onto a 4-day working week because I think it became so stressful for people, and I think needed more space in their lives. Some people are experimenting with 6-hour days. I think that looking at shorter working hours, asking people in return for their engagement, for their interest, for their positivity, and then giving them more space outside of work to do it. And I think this is going to be a critical thing for businesses managing in this, living with COVID world. So we're Friday Pulse. We're kind of here to help. That's what we do. I am a speaker, obviously. I have my own work too. But as an organization, what we've done is we've moved to a 3-month free trial for organizations where they can use the product. It is new types of data. We support you to do that and see what we're doing. There's an upper limit of 1,000 people on it, but it's better always to try things with divisions rather than roll them out. And yeah, that's my case really, that feelings are data. You can measure them and they do impact your organizations. It's a new type of data to work with, but it will complement the other types of data you have in people analytics. And I'm hoping that we can all change the world of the work for better by looking at how people feel at work every week.
Nick, thank you so much. There are people in the chat who are thanking you. They already feel happier just as a result of listening to you for the last 30 minutes. So I don't know if that's another data point that you can add. Absolutely captured as always.
It's a great privilege being able to talk about happiness because it's fun and it engages us all. Yeah. So I'm very happy with my choice of happiness.
I have a couple of questions, and we have some questions from the audience as well. Actually, one is more of an observation than a question, I think. You had shared with us the time series, the kind of pre and during COVID, and what you talked about as being the resilience curve. And what I hadn't really appreciated until you mentioned it, that actually this is happening on a continuous basis within a team or an organization, maybe to a lesser extent, all the time.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned that for your own time series, they were clients already using Friday Pulse, so they were perhaps had an advantage in the terms of their intentionality around building resilience within those teams. But what does it look like after we get back to where we were? Is there a pattern kind of after the back to where we were that actually sees it increase? And then when the cycle happens again, it increases again. What does that typically look like?
Well, I mean, COVID is such an extraordinary event because it's global, and I don't suppose we'll ever see a big pattern across our clients like it again. I mean, we get these slight seasonal effects, as I say, but in organizations, you see these patterns all the time, and you see it. You see teams, falling for particular local problems, and this is basically the data that we surface of it within an organization. Every team has got a different shape, and we've had some teams that have thrived through COVID. Yeah. And we've had some organizations that have gone bust. We've had clients that have folded, or everyone's furloughed so that they're not using it. So there's a huge variety. Everyone will know that the mean hides a lot of variation, and the variation is actually where the interest is. And so if you're HR analytics or in HR and you're managing data like this, you're looking every month to see which teams are falling. Is there something you can do about it? Maybe they've had a bad week and they bounce back, so you don't have to do anything. But if they have 3 bad weeks, you get an alert and you can start thinking about doing something. So it's having the data in real time that actually creates the tool that becomes really useful. I'm not hearing you, Teresa.
No, I'm sorry. I just lost the connection, the audio there for a second.
Oh,
Are you hearing me now?
I'm hearing you now, yeah. I think I answered that question.
Well, actually, your answer kind of led us into one of the questions that came from the viewers about, is happiness a permanent state? And I think what I heard from you is that, no, it can change, and also it may depend on how you define it.
I definitely think that happiness it ebbs and flows in all of our lives. We have good days, we have bad days, we have good periods in a day, we have less good periods in a day, and you can think of happiness in different ways, and psychologists do, so that they what I'm basically doing is what's called episodal measurement, because I'm defining a period of time. There are psychologists that look at it very affect emotionally based, and they do things called experience sampling, which is where they interrupt people's experience, say, how are you feeling right now? We see a lot of ebb and flowing in that. And then there are other ones that look at it as an overall sort of trait measure, where they're asking you evaluatively, and this is particularly where a measure like life satisfaction comes in. But, if you consider your life overall, how satisfied are you nowadays, or how happy are you these days? And those more cognitive ones are more stable, because they're more about whether your life's going well overall than not. But even that, we have periods in life, we'll all know this personally. I'm someone that, has been divorced, and I had a period of my life when my life really wasn't going very well, and then I bounced back, So these things move at different cadences. It moves on a daily basis. Sometimes it's on a yearly basis. You have a bad few years, you bounce back. So I see happiness as more fluid than that. It's not a beach you go and lie on. It's more of a dynamic balance.
Thank you. Although, did you not just get back from a beach vacation?
You know me too well. We did. And it was a total joy. COVID was difficult, and I hadn't had a week off this year. And in August, when the weather started to get bad in the UK, I snapped. And I said to Zoe, I need a holiday. And we risked it, and we went to a Greek island, and we actually were going for a week, and we extended and stayed 11 days. It was so lovely. And I'm obviously very lucky I can do that, but it does show you that we need breaks from work, and I think a lot of us probably, pushed through with COVID. And I expect that there's going to be a lot of problems with burnout with people particularly highly engaged people, who've gone not only the extra mile, but gone the extra 100 miles, and are starting to feel it now. And I think looking after ourselves and self-care and supporting our employees to take time to look after themselves is critical. So I think of our beach holiday as self-care.
There was absolutely no judgment here, more jealousy than anything else. I love the fact that you I guess drink your own champagne. You've now gone to a 4-day week within Friday Pulse. Have there been other initiatives like that you've seen your clients using, and how have they been able to kind of implement those?
We've obviously had a lot of clients that have gone to remote working. Our client base tends to be biased towards desk working environments. We used to call them office work, but I think we have to call them desk-based now. We've had a lot of interest from our clients about what we're doing. I mean, I announced it. Like, it's not for everybody, the 4-day working week, but I haven't seen any change in productivity from the team. I wouldn't say it's increased. There's some people that claim it increases it. I was doing it more for well-being and staff retention in lots of ways. And actually, I think talent attraction, I think very attractive to be a 4-day-a-week company for people, pay the same money and be 4 days a week is very attractive. We can't not overpay. We can't do the very top rates. So I think it's a way of us attracting talent. A lot of organizations have done a lot of buddying systems to make sure that people start having, don't lose friendships at work. But as you could see, friendships is under pressure, even in our clients. And I think that there's going to be some things with COVID that are cumulative and that we need to do some things about it. We're starting to meet a little bit as teams now. But my team are not very keen on coming back in the office, mainly for public transport. I think they don't like the idea of getting on trains and tubes and buses and things. So, and they're working perfectly home from work. So we've got a huge shake-up in how work is going, which I would actually think is more of an opportunity for Friday Pulse, but we'll see.
So speaking of that, who is your typical buyer? Is this within the domain of HR?
Yeah, we're mainly working with small organizations at the moment, and it tends to be a C-suite purchase in the end, because the data does influence how people work. So in some ways, we would think of it as positively disruptive in an organization. So if it doesn't get buy-in at the top and it doesn't get some leadership from the top, then it can not work out. So we've had people do the trial where there's an enthusiastic employee, because it's free, they do it, and they don't get buy-in from C-suite, and we don't get the response rate, and it doesn't work out. Whereas if you get buy-in from, the CEO or the finance director or whatever, and of course the chief human resources officer or chief people officer, whatever they're called, then it tends to work. And it is a change of culture, because what we really say is that, yes, it's only 2 minutes on a Friday to fill out, but on a Monday or Tuesday, you're best off if you have 10 minutes as a team talking about the data. So it is a cultural change. We are a tool that tries to not only measure, but improve happiness at work, or employee experience, you can call it. So it's best if it's got buy-in right from the top.
Great, thank you. And we have another question here around happiness, and I'm not sure whether we're kind of unpacking this in, Lego blocks of feelings, but are there any other feelings or data from feelings that impact some of the ROI that you mentioned there?
So quite often people will ask about stress. How stressed are people? And stress is sort of a -5 to 0 variable, in that, once if stress is very bad, it really impacts you, but it hasn't. But less stress is not necessarily good, so you haven't really got that positive upside. And I've experimented also with asking about interest at work. How interesting is your work, and that works pretty well too. But it's sort of not got the joy. It's not got the breadth that happiness. And happiness, in a way, is people's own reflection on their own terms about what's going well for their work. So it's definitely the one that I think is the best to work with. Just like we ask customers, "Are you happy?" Asking employees makes a lot of sense to do that. And I, when I looked at data, so I've been experimenting with this for 8 years, worked with over 10,000 teams actually collecting data. When you ask questions such as happiness, and then you ask about stress and interest, I'd enter those into equations if it was predicting staff turnover, for example, and a linear regression model, or perhaps slightly differently. But you'd find that happiness explained nearly all of the variance, that basically interest and stress were adding very little extra variance. So for one question, you get most of the data you need. In fact, even I've done 40 question surveys, the one question, is your work going well, are you happy or not, is probably explaining between 30 and 40% of the variance for one click. And that's what really persuaded me. We're looking for the good bad signal here, and that was the best thing to work with. And then, as I said, there's limits to measurement, and I think mainly then that's why we go quite qualitative. We start asking people when they use the tool, what's a success for you this week? Do you want to thank anybody? Have you got an idea? Have you got a frustration? We ask them to put that into words, because I think that the good, bad signal I'm very, very confident of, and I think it gives you so much. And then, let teams work with their own specific situation. So even when I ask 40 questions, the context I still don't understand when I look at the data, whereas everyone in the team understands their own context, so they'll interpret the data much better than I ever could do. So I've really, really strived to make it simple. And I think what's interesting is that I think simplicity connects with people. It helps them understand. It helps them want to work with it. When you go complex, it puts them off. So we've striven for that. We've striven, strove, strive. I don't know, for the simplicity.
I know you've had a long day there already of filming. I realized that the suit and shirt were not just for us, but thank you anyway. I want to also, you mentioned that you probably wouldn't win a Nobel Prize for some of the research, but since we are calling this the Academy Awards of People Analytics and Future of Work over the last couple of days, I would like to present to you as a nominee, at least, for an Academy Award for PAFOW. And if there was a category for the most anthropology and also numbers of animals in the slide deck, you would definitely win. In fact, I think when you said the word hair, my dog entered the room. So he obviously was interested in that. Nick, thank you so much. Seeing you has made me feel really sad that we haven't been able to get together the last 6 months or year. So really looking forward to that. And thank you for sharing all of your insights. I've put your website into the chat so people can get hold of you. And we'll also be putting this session onto the on-demand room. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll be back after a short break with Al, and he'll be talking with David Yang from YVA.ai. Thanks again, Nick. Cheers and take care.